Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I am Steve Leibowitz. The Jewish New Year comes to an end Friday night. 5783 was certainly a memorable year. The year ending with a potential constitutional crisis looming in Israel today. All 15 justices convened for the first time considering petitions to strike down the recently passed Basic Law, the Reasonableness Law, the first and only piece of divisive judicial reform legislation passed into law by the coalition amid 36 weeks of mass protest by those who consider the law as damaging blows to democracy. And joining us to discuss are Times of Israel editor-in-chief David Horowitz, who has sounded alarms against the coalition attempts, and Dr. Gerald Steinberg, a leading political scientist and head of NGO Monitor. David, if I could start with you, maybe it's all too obvious, but what would you say is the top story of the year and why?
I guess the top story of the year is the election and then construction of the coalition that now governs Israel. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of repercussion and implication of that process, but that's what set it in motion. Remember, we'd had a succession of elections in recent years, basically 5 in less than 4 years. And only with this fifth one was long-standing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who'd been out of office for 18 months, able to return to power with, by what Israeli standards is a fairly substantial majority, 64 to 56. But the components of his 64-strong coalition are the only parties that will sit with him in government. And they include parties, both of the ultra-Orthodox parties and parties from the far right of the political spectrum, including, for example, the man he made Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who not too long ago Netanyahu said was not fit to sit in a coalition with him. So you had an election and then the bringing together of a coalition that I don't think anyone would argue is the most hard line in Israeli state history, in the modern history of the state. And then in the first week of its governance, Netanyahu's justice minister unveiled what he called the first phase of judicial reform with a package of planned legislation that, in my assessment, certainly neuters the High Court, shatters the balance of powers between the branches of government, and if enacted in full, would give the elected majority almost absolute power in Israel. And that has, in turn, ushered in a tremendous national divide, a huge rift, which, in the words of the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, just hours ago, from Netanyahu's own Likud party, has permeated the military and security apparatuses to the extent that if it is not resolved, it endangers their capacity to protect the state. Now, there's lots of reasons why Gallant, who has publicly warned several times about this rift, why he sees this essentially coming to constitute an existential threat to Israel, to undermine Israel's capacity to defend itself. But that's a pretty staggering and radical and dramatic conclusion to that sequence of events that began with the elections and the cobbling of this coalition together.
Gerald, if I could, I want to focus on the issue that's on the agenda today. The government is warning the court that if they dare strike down this quasi-constitutional basic law, the result will be anarchy. This is the government saying it. How so, and how is that likely to play out in the Knesset and in the streets?
In many ways, I think today's hearing in the court, the various presentations that were made, the judges are not going to rule today. It may take weeks or months. But in very, very many ways, it encapsulates the conflict. And I think it goes much further back and much deeper in many more layers. It's like an archaeological dig. You unveil one layer and you have another layer and another layer and another layer. And I think that's what we see encapsulated in everything that David said and also in today's hearing, in the sense that this is a monumental struggle. It's a struggle between very different, we call them tribes, and in Israel, but also camps And the coalition, we're talking about a number, I've lost track of how many parties, and factions within the parties are in this coalition. And Likud itself, the dominant party, has a number of different factions in it as well. In many ways, the Israeli political system is broken. So is the American system, the British system, but the Israeli system, it's maybe I can use the term, more broken. And there's more, obviously, the stakes are very high for Israel. And that's what we're seeing here. So the conflict is between, first of all, the Knesset, the majority in the Knesset, as David said, 64 votes, with a very problematic, I'll use that term, coalition in terms of they have very different values, different approaches. And of course, Mr. Netanyahu is in his 14th year, ostensibly is the head of the coalition, but not really so much, because this is not the legal reform process, the whole campaign is not really, it's not his baby. It's not his primary issue. Yes, it does affect his trial, but I think that it's caused him more difficulties, and I think he realizes that, than benefits. And Yariv Levin, we're seeing now on the screen, is this is something he's been working on for 20 years, and he is now in a position to pursue this along with Simcha Rotman, another member from one of the religious parties in the coalition, modern Orthodox, but not Haredi, but still. And it's on the Haredi agenda as well, all members of the coalition. And their view is that the court system, the 15 members of that court, particularly the Supreme Justice, Esther Chayut, secular, universal, not sufficiently Zionist, not sufficiently Jewish, injecting values, concepts, principles into Israeli political decisions, which they don't have a mandate to do. That's what we heard in a lot of ways today from Simcha Rotman, one of the main people who presented the position that the court should not overrule the Knesset. They have no right to overrule the Knesset. So this is a monumental struggle, and it's not simply about the one law which the Knesset succeeded, or the government succeeded in passing, on what's called the reasonableness clause, which in my personal opinion is really a very minor part of what this is all about, including who selects judges. There are serious problems in the system that was sort of put together in the 50s and in a very I won't say arbitrary, but not a very in-depth approach. We don't have a constitution. We don't have agreed upon principles of how this government is, how the country should be run, or what the societal principles that hold us together are. And this is all coming out in this process. Well,
David, only a small number of ministers have indicated that they're even going to honor a bagatz if it strikes this basic law down. The government is warning of the potential for chaos if the courts strike down the law passed by the Knesset to curb the court's authority, setting up a real constitutional crisis. Is the day of doom upon us? Where are we at?
Well, that's a pretty apocalyptic way of putting it, and I'm used to, cornering the market on apocalyptic assessments. So, day of doom, please God, let's hope not. But let's not underestimate how significant this is. It's a combination. I mean, Gerald is right to say this is, it's one law. It's not the most significant law of the planned overhaul. But in a way, it heralds the entire face-off, if you like. And it's worth elaborating on a couple of the points that Gerald made. We don't have a constitution. We have these quasi-constitutional basic laws, and therefore the unfamiliar viewer may think, well, if that's the closest thing, then surely that's not something that the High Court would easily intervene against. But the problem with the basic laws is that despite that grandiose title, almost all of the basic laws can be easily legislated and amended. And indeed, the reasonableness amendment passed by 64 to 0, actually, because the entire coalition voted for it and the entire opposition boycotted the vote. But it's not as though it required some kind of special majority, which would by necessity include parts of the opposition. So a like-minded coalition, which by definition has a majority in the Knesset, can steamroll through changes even to these grand-sounding basic laws with considerable ease. This coalition is not the first to do it. But the practice is extremely troubling for the court. I don't think anyone can gauge on the basis of the first few hours what the court might do. But certainly the thrust of the justice's initial questioning was to assert a legitimate right to review and potentially strike down basic laws. the consequent point that should be made as well, in the absence of a constitution,